This week on Just Solutions, Kyle Rittenhouse was found not guilty of all charges after he killed 2 protesters and shot another during anti-racism demonstrations in Kenosha, Wisconsin last summer. Many people are concerned that the verdict gives a green light for vigilantes to take up arms against civil and social justice protesters. In addition, 11 states have passed anti-protest legislation and at least 231 bills have been introduced across 45 states. These include laws that protect drivers who strike and injure protesters. Colour of Change has started a campaign to demand state governors stop anti-protest laws from passing. Our guest today, Scott Roberts, Senior Director of Criminal Justice Campaigns at Colour of Change, says there's a dangerous pattern of trying to silence protest against police violence. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Scott, it's great to have you with us. And we are going to talk about the fallout from the Rittenhouse verdict and what that means in terms of empowering armed vigilantes to show up at these protests. But the wave of anti-protest legislation that's coming through state houses and being introduced at a federal level is being described as unprecedented. And indeed, the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law has a US protest law tracker. They've been tracking it since 2017, but it does seem that there's been a huge push for this type of legislation in the wake of the racial justice protests that we saw in the summer of 2020. And I know this is something that Colour of Change has specifically been concerned about. Tell us exactly what's going on.
Yeah, for us, this is about responding to the backlash against, the growing political power of Black folks in the United States. We see these anti-protest bills very much aligned with the voter suppression bills that have been moving throughout the country, just as those are a response to the growing, electoral power as more and more Black folks are turning out to vote. Black communities continue to remain a pretty solidified voting bloc. We've seen suppression, bills moving in states across the country. Similarly, in response to, our historical protest movement from last year, a movement that was the largest protest movement in the history of our country. These anti-protest bills are a response to that. And they are intended to intimidate people and discourage people from exercising their First Amendment rights. We already know that, violence and protests are illegal, but these laws, many of them increase the penalties for people who have been, who are convicted of convictions, related to protest. That includes more harsher, jail time, fines, things of that nature, but also kind of moves into new areas of punishment for protesters, such as, restricting people's access to student loans or other kind of services like that. So just looking for any ways to discourage folks. And then the most dangerous, especially when we think about the fallout from the Rittenhouse verdict, is that some of these laws, that great intro you all did in the beginning, said that 11 of these bills have passed around the country. Some of them in places like Oklahoma, in places like Florida, include provisions that justify violence against protesters. Just as your intro said, that people can hit protesters with vehicles, as we saw in Charlottesville and as we've seen in response to, the tactic of blocking intersections that has been, a part of the movement in defense of Black lives, really since Ferguson. These laws are giving justifications for people who are committing those types of acts. So when you look at the combination of a verdict that we saw in the Rittenhouse trial, along with these laws that codify, these defenses, it just feels like they are giving a permission slip to people who want to commit vigilante violence against protesters. And they're telling protesters that you will not be protected. Your life and your health, is not a priority in these situations. So again, this is about trying to resist the increase in power and the fact that racial justice is now a winning strategy in the country, that so many people are coming to this movement. These anti-protest bills are a response to that, in an effort to slow down the momentum of our movement.
And it's worth mentioning that this is largely a Republican legislative effort here. We're seeing this being passed by governors, like in Florida with DeSantis there, signing into law some of these pieces of legislation. But we're seeing this really in these Republican-led states. And even at a federal level, some of this type of legislation we'll talk about in a minute is led by Republicans, which is interesting because many of these are legislators who deny the reality of what happened on January 6th and the insurrection. And yet at the same time, they're using January 6th as an excuse to push through some of these anti-protest bills that largely target people of color.
Yeah, I think this was one of the tensions that we felt on January 6th, right? I mean, obviously that was an unprecedented effort to disrupt, the certification of a presidential election. A riot in the U.S. Capitol is, so far beyond, people setting trash cans on fire during the summer of 2020, or, the kind of property damage that was so often, equivocated with violence. But yeah, there's a deep hypocrisy there. And we felt that tension even as we saw those people going into the Capitol, because we knew that the response would be, as almost always is in the United States, when we see a problem, we say we need more law enforcement, we need more jails, more jail time, more prison time for people, and we need new laws that further criminalize things. And so, yes, even if we see bills or laws that are put in place, presumably because of January 6th, we know that enforcement almost always means that Black and brown communities and the people who are standing with us are more likely to, suffer the consequences, right? And we have to be careful about putting additional laws and penalties on the books, because, the people who enforce that, police, prosecutors, they have a long track record of not applying the law equally to our communities or even to our movements, right? Movements on the left have always been more likely to be subject to military and police violence as a response. So I think it is concerning when you see those things. I think, you've pointed out that a lot of this stuff is coming from Republicans, but I think that we have to be vigilant also with Democrats. I think many Democrats are feeling the pressure of the narrative around protests being disruptive to the order of our country, of protests that are largely peaceful being described as violent, and they're not willing to push back on that. They are willing to, though, fall into those same kinds of ideas of, we need increased laws, things like that. If you look at Eric Adams, for instance, who was recently elected mayor of New York City, he's come out very strongly saying that, New York will not be a place where there will be riots and things like that. New York was never, never failed to, citywide riots or anything like that during the protest movement. But people think, I think increasingly Democratic politicians also think that they have to pay lip service to this notion that our protests are a threat to safety, to order in the country and in the cities that they lead. So I think we have to be vigilant also with those folks. They may not be passing these laws, but if they're telling their police departments to crack down on protests, then some of the same danger is there.
Well, I know that the Color of Change wrote a letter in August to the US Department of Justice, alerting them to the concern that not just your organization, but many, many advocacy groups, including the ACLU and many other groups involved in peaceful protests, are raising, and that the concerns that they have about the implications of this. Have you heard anything from the Department of Justice, albeit it's a different Department of Justice than it was during the summer when we saw in 2020, when we saw so much unrest around racial justice issues?
Yes. So thanks for bringing up the letter. This is one of our most important kind of campaign interventions that we're making in this effort to protect protesters. We did, write an open letter to the Department of Justice, as you said, a few months ago, in close partnership with Free Press and Media Justice Project, our close partners there, as well as other groups, as you said, signed on to that. Yes, we have heard from the Department of Justice. As you said, it's a different place. The Civil Rights Department is now led by Vanita Gupta, who, prior to her position was someone who was a civil rights lawyer and, has worked to protect people's civil rights. So we've talked to them. I think what I can say is that they are taking a look at this for sure. Our message to them is basically where I started in this conversation, which is, you're taking action against voter suppression laws like we saw in Georgia. Just this week, they've taken action against the redistricting proposal coming out of Texas. And so in those ways, they've been working to defend people's democratic rights. And our message to them has been protest is also part of our democratic process and is part of our set of democratic rights. And you should treat these laws similarly. And so we've been asking them to make interventions in places like Florida, where local litigators have already filed civil rights lawsuits. Department of Justice can come in and issue a statement of support, which is very influential in the case. So we know they're taking a look at it. It's something that is out of their kind of out of their norms. They don't have a section, for instance, like a team of lawyers who work on anti-protest bills, the way that they do on voting rights, for instance. So they're going through a process of reviewing it. We know that they're taking a close look, and we are encouraging people to join the campaign to further encourage them, to encourage the White House, who, of course, at the end of the day are the bosses over DOJ and all the cabinet departments. But we're hopeful that they will take some type of action. Obviously within these states, the folks who are in power are unlikely to reverse course. And one of the, best tools historically for Black communities in terms of resisting these types of efforts has been the federal government and the Department of Justice. So we're hopeful that they're going to take action.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what's happening at a federal level here, because as we have been describing, very similar to what's happening with voting rights suppression, we're seeing this movement happening in state legislatures. And most of these bills, in fact, all of these bills that we're talking about are playing out at a state level. But at a federal level, there have been efforts over the years to introduce some type of federal legislation. Most of them have failed. Some of that was around, targeting protests near pipelines, of course. That was in the aftermath of Standing Rock. There was a bill that was introduced in January, on the 13th of January, that would strip pandemic aid from individuals convicted of protest-related federal crimes. Yeah. Similar measures were introduced and actually were defeated last year. So we're seeing a little bit of movement at a federal level with efforts to introduce these type of bills. Are you concerned about any of this federal legislation, or is it really the state legislation that you're focusing on?
Yes, we're concerned about what's happening federally. I think with the point that you made about pipeline protests is very important for folks to understand that in the last year, we've seen about 100 bills introduced. But as you said, going back to 2017, George Floyd and the protests that happened, people were also moving this, and it was in large part in response to environmental protests. And so there is a need for these movements to unify. And we have to give a lot of credit actually to our brothers and sisters in the environmental movement who were fighting this beforehand. At the federal level, so, right now things feel safe, right? That, it's unlikely that people will be blocked from, government assistance and support, especially in the middle of the pandemic, with the current folks in control of Congress, with Democratic control over both houses. I think we don't know how long that's going to last, right? And I wouldn't even be surprised to see Republicans running on this issue, right? We've seen them trying to weaponize our calls for racial justice through, their attacks on education on the racial history of the United States, which they falsely label as critical race theory, in their attacks and attempts to label their opponents as in support of the call to redefine public safety, that was encapsulated in the slogan, defund the police. And so I think you will see, likely an effort to leverage protest against the Democratic candidates, and to offer people, as part of their law and order regime and agenda, that they'll, promote these types of laws and their efforts to stop protests, especially if we see another wave of protest, next year ahead of the midterms, which, summers are usually the time when we start to see that activity. So yeah, I think, should the dynamics in Washington change, those things are a real threat. And they expand the impact so much more broadly, because, as you said, these anti-protest laws right now are moving in states that are under really conservative control. And so the federal government, especially, should folks who would support anti-protest laws eventually gain control of the executive branch, and were to pass laws like that, we saw already with Trump, the willingness to leverage the Department of Justice, the FBI, all the law enforcement tools that the federal government has against protest. And I think, any additional criminalization or laws that restrict people's access to loans or government assistance will be more heavily enforced by a Republican administration. So I think what we have to do now is really defeat these as ideas. We have to defeat these laws, but generally we have to have a strong portion of our society that says, no matter what side you're on, we shouldn't be putting in draconian measures to stifle people's freedom of speech and their right to protest. So I think that's why we have to win, so that even if these folks gain power, and, as we know in our political system, those cycles we go in, they likely will be back in power at some point. This won't be something that they feel like they can advance and move forward.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching right now and your thoughts on this. Is this something that you have been aware of? Is it something you're concerned about? And in fact, we have a viewer in New Zealand watching on Facebook right now and asking, well, do protesters really burn stuff, or are we just, is this something that happens at protests? This doesn't happen apparently in New Zealand. I think that's an interesting point, because very often the media focuses on that aspect. If property is destroyed, which really underpins priorities in this country, everyone gets upset when property is destroyed. That then becomes the focus of very often mainstream media coverage, as opposed to the underlying issues that are bringing people out to the streets. And I know the Colour of Change has released a media guide to really let people know that the language that is used by the media in describing protests is very, very crucial, and actually really links to some of this legislation that's being pushed through. Is it a protest? Is it a riot? The two things are not interchangeable, and yet the two things are often conflated, and we're seeing that conflation in some of these bills as well. What should viewers pay attention to when they're seeing coverage, particularly on mainstream corporate media outlets that maybe would have a specific political slant, when they're seeing coverage of protests? What should people be aware of how media is covering this?
Yeah, this is an incredibly important question. I really thank that viewer all the way from New Zealand for asking that. I think, first of all, I just want to speak to the question: are people setting fires at protests in the United States? Yes, they are, but very few of them are doing that, right? And I think that's to the crux of your question, right? Which is, how are protests being portrayed? Our media is very sensational. There's a saying in a lot of newsrooms in the United States, if it bleeds, it leads, I should say. So, the more conflict, the more disruptive something feels, the more likely it is to make the news. And so we saw the images that were coming out of the protests, and we saw protests, millions of people participating in these protests in every state in the country, in countries around the world even. Studies have shown that protests were over 90% peaceful, that 90% of all protests were peaceful. And then when you look at the small portion that are labeled as not being peaceful, what you're often seeing is one or two actors, some who were eventually proven to be right-wing agitators like Umbrella Man. I don't know if you remember that. He was in Minneapolis. This was one of the first real images that came out of people breaking windows early on in the George Floyd protests. Eventually, that guy was shown to be an oath keeper. I believe he's definitely in one of these January 6th organizations, right? And so we have to be very careful. One, understand that you're seeing an exaggerated version of what's happening because they're focusing on a fire that's been set or a window that's been broken out or even a skirmish that may break out between protesters and right-wing agitators. And I'm calling them agitators because these are people like the Proud Boys who show up to fight, right? And then when racial justice protesters defend themselves, it's described as combat, as opposed to, one side attacking. But this is incredibly important. I talked about this a lot. We were talking about early on in this conversation, the fallout from the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. I don't believe we get to a Kyle Rittenhouse at all, that Kyle Rittenhouse doesn't end up, in those protests in Kenosha, that he doesn't show up with an assault rifle with a group of other vigilantes. He doesn't ultimately kill 2 people and wound others. If we didn't see this sensationalized coverage of the protests, and that was combined with the right-wing rhetoric that was coming from, as you alluded to, right-wing media, but it was also coming from right-wing politicians, namely Donald Trump, who was in the White House at the time. The language that he was using was that our society was basically disintegrating, right? And then the media was broadcasting that type of analysis without any real pushback, and also sensationalizing what was happening so that people like Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old child, really, not excusing anything that he did, but I think he was very susceptible to this notion that law and order in the country was failing, that somebody needed to step up and do something, or that property damage is actually the real concern rather than are Black people safe to live and thrive in the United States. And so, yes, I think the media should take a lot of responsibility. And even going forward, we have to get real about what's actually happening, keep the focus on the issues that matter, put in perspective when we see, a trash can on fire, that's something that can be done by one person out of millions who have taken the streets with these demands, so that we don't encourage people like Kyle Rittenhouse who feel that, they have some duty to protect, the general order of the country from taking the type of action that he did. So, the media has to be really responsible. As you said, we have published a guide for journalists on how to cover protests, how to avoid the sensationalism, how to talk about, racial justice within that context, how to consider whether or not protesters are being portrayed fairly across different protest movements, right? How are these pro-Trump protesters being treated in relation to Black Lives Matter protesters, things of that nature, how to think about and talk about the police response. I think what we often see is also that law enforcement's portrayal and analysis of any protest is offered as the official, official narrative. And obviously, when you're talking about protests that are targeted at transforming law enforcement and how we engage in the, in public safety in the United States, that is not, the law enforcement is not a fair and unbiased arbiter of what's happening in the street. So I think, we're making that intervention, and as we see more and more as more protests get initiated, so following the Rittenhouse verdict, things like that, we're always re-upping it to journalists, trying to get them, aligned with our thoughts on it. And we do see, a lot of folks embracing that. It's often, journalists who are people of color themselves. But again, media has an incredibly important role to play in terms of both, accurately describing our protests and not encouraging people like Kyle Rittenhouse to take types of action that he did.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, but I really do want to talk just briefly about, so many of these protests are around police brutality, and particularly, the intersection with racism and what's happening with policing. And of course, a rallying cry at many of these protests were defund the police.
Mm-hmm.
As part of some of these bills that we're seeing, this wave of anti-protest bills, we're also seeing language in there that targets not just protesters, but actual communities and municipalities
Right.
that may seek to reduce funding for their police departments as well. They're being threatened with a reduction in funding. Very briefly touch on that, because I know this is another issue tangential to what we're talking about.
Yeah, this is actually a great topic. We could talk for another 30 minutes about this. This is one of the primary tools of white supremacists in America, is something called preemption. And in states, especially throughout the South, where there are localities, think about Atlanta, Jackson, Mississippi, Birmingham, Alabama, places like Broward County, Florida, Tallahassee, Florida, where Republicans control state legislatures, but there are urban areas and cities that are firmly in control of Black politicians. Sometimes, in the case of a place like Jackson, Mississippi, radical Black leadership in the form of Chokwe Lumumba, right? So but these states are then putting laws in place, and this goes really before the defund movement. They were blocking gun control, other types of interventions that were meant to protect and keep Black folks safe. And they are not being consistent, in my opinion, with their own views on things like states' rights, local control, the autonomy that communities should have to make their own decisions. And so they're putting in place laws now that restrict local communities from making decisions about how they're going to engage in public safety. So the call to defund the police is really a more, complex demand than just, take money away from the police. It's yes, we should be spending down on police, right? Like, let's bring spending down on police so we can invest in real solutions for safety. Community-based violence intervention and prevention, right? Police show up after someone's been shot. There are proven programs throughout the country that show that if you invest in the communities that are most harmed by gun violence, for instance, that you can bring down those rates of gun violence. You can prevent gun violence rather than just looking for who did the shooting. And so these laws are really, they're blocking our ability to make our communities safer, right? And it's political. And this has to do with the right wing's close ties to police unions and their efforts to always be putting more money in the pockets of police officers and police unions. But this is also just about resistance to growing political power amongst Black folks. I mean, these are places that these politicians don't live. They don't represent the constituents in these places, but they're making it their business to tell these folks how to secure and make our communities safe. It is one of the biggest tools of white supremacy in this country right now, because it takes away the biggest blocks of Black political power, which is often in the cities where we form either a majority or very large minorities, right? And that's where we have political power. They're also doing this to try and block the work of locally elected prosecutors. Following the Ferguson protests, organizations like mine, Color of Change, but many other organizations and activists around the country said, look, these prosecutors are basically acting as defense attorneys for the police when they commit violence against us. And they're leading the charge on over incarceration throughout the country. So we focused on them in the places where we had political power. We elected people who are now implementing the agenda for reform. Prosecutors who are prosecuting less people, holding less people pre-trial, who are pushing for the same types of investments in community to prevent crime. And we have both state attorney generals and legislatures that are actively working to take cases away from them, block them from implementing the policies that they were elected to implement. And so, for our communities, this is not about, just like defund the police and let's have chaos, right? Like, we're trying to rework public safety so it actually works for our communities. So our communities are safe, they're able to thrive, they have the investments they need, and we're not using a system that is going to commit violence against our communities, that's going to disappear folks away from our communities, put them in jails, prisons, detention centers. At the same time, right? We can have solutions that actually help our communities thrive and bring down violence and increase safety. So,
well, as we said,
I know we have to go.
That topic deserves a whole half-hour show in and of itself. And so, Scott, we will have to have you back because it really is something significant that is happening and really worth the conversation. But I would direct people to the website for Color of Change, because there is a lot of information about everything that we have talked about here, as well as ways to get involved. There are petitions and various different actions happening, and Color of Change has a lot of information. Well, Scott, we so appreciate you taking time to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And join us next week, same time, same place, for another conversation on Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.